2050 is now here. Is the world better off because your company is in it? We're now facing kind of like a final exam for humanity. Can we work together?
Welcome to the second Renaissance, where we decode the rebirth of human creativity in a technology-driven world. In this second season, we explore how sustainability is elevating our human consciousness and catalyzing us to create within constraints. We decipher why now is the biggest entrepreneurial opportunity since the dawn of industrialization, and what leaders can do to harness the winds of change. I'm Andrew Sorman-Nilsson, global futurist, impact champion, and father, and your host for the second Renaissance. Today we're speaking with Andrew Winston from Eco Strategies, who's an early pioneer in the field of purpose and profit-driven enterprise. Andrew has written 3 influential books on business strategy, including the highly regarded The Big Pivot and the best-selling sustainable strategy book of the last 15 years, Green to Gold, which Inc. magazine included on its all-time list of 30 books that every manager should own. He's also written hundreds of articles and publications like Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review, and consulted with brands like Apple, DuPont, Walmart, and Unilever. His latest book is Net Positive, co-authored with the former CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman. Andrew and I sit down for a deep and meaningful on how courageous companies thrive by giving more than they take, why the climate goalposts have shifted from 2050 to 2030, the ticking climate clock, and why sustainability is now an innovation catalyst for smart leaders. Thank you for joining us, Andrew.
It's good to see you again. I haven't seen you in a long time. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and I think back to the last time we actually spent some face-to-face time, I believe it was Portugal, Lisbon, 2014, over a glass of red wine, no doubt. That seems like a very, very distant past.
Ages ago, apparently for you, before even children, right? Like you were in a totally different place. My kids were much younger. Yeah, it's a different world. Feels very different now.
Yeah, certainly does. The idea of getting onto a plane seems very foreign or very alien these days. Not to think about, of course, all the carbon emissions we used to emit. I hazard a guess to say that you, like me, were probably carbon offsetting those and avoiding as much travel as we could. But nonetheless, we're now disseminating ideas digitally. I should kick things off here and just say, you know, we sort of paused all of these crazy old ideas like, you know, physically traveling around the world during the pandemic. What's been your observation now with launching your new book, Net Positive? What have been your observations in terms of the pandemic? Has it accelerated awareness? Has it, decelerated carbon emissions? What's the state of play at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's had a huge impact, really. I mean, obviously, it's affected everything, and we're still seeing the ripples. I mean, the pandemic's still going globally in a very real way, and we've seen the ripples. What's going on with supply chains around the world right now is just unbelievable. There's just all these problems, and I think it's identified a bunch of things that we knew, but wasn't in our face that much, right? Just this idea that we're kind of all connected. I think hopefully we've walked away with more sense of that. I mean, we clearly share one immune system. We've kind of figured that out, but that the connections and the systemic issues we face I think the pandemic really brought it to the fore. You know, I think the last couple of years for business and what it means to be business and business in society, like the role of business in society, more has changed, I think, in the last 2 years than in the previous 20 that I've been doing this work. And the pandemic was a major part of it. Other things, got in there. The murder of George Floyd in the US rippled into this racial awareness around the world, the Me Too movement, LGBTQ rights, like all these things came together. And I think partly because we were all just sitting around in our homes watching things and kind of intently thinking about things. You've seen millions of people have decided to take a different path in their career because of this time off. There's a huge shortage in some areas. So yes, I think what's expected of business radically changed. And partly was when the pandemic started, companies had to respond and decide who they were, really. Were they going to start giving stuff away to save lives? Were they going to, guarantee their employees work, help their suppliers and customers, giving them financing? Like, these were the things the leaders did, and others kind of floundered, right? But it was a real test of like, who is the business? Who do you really serve? What are you here for? And I think that's the core of my work, really, kind of the purpose of business, and how do you drive business to serve the world?
So, I mean, you were sort of, you were one of the early ones, I would hazard a guess to say. I mean, certainly, Dr. Seuss and the Lorax might have come just before you. But I mean,
just before,
you've been in this. Yeah, just before. I think the Lorax, by the way, turned 50 just a couple of months ago. But, you came out with a book, Green to Gold, the Green Recovery, then the Big Pivot. I mean, you were ahead of the game before this sustainability thing went mainstream, as Forbes magazine called it in 2020.
Yeah.
You must have seen like a lunatic greenie back in the day. But today, I think, all the arguments is that, ESG and doing well on ESG factors is actually the only sustainable, but also the only profitable way forward. Have you got any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, the 20 years I've been in this, it's hard to believe when I say that out loud. It's kind of remarkable to me, because I was kind of the young gun in this field when I came out with my first book. I was still in my mid 30s, and there had been people working on this for decades, and I call some of them mentors and friends now. And the business world was still very skeptical, right? I mean, I got into this, I had an MBA, and I went back to school to get an environmental degree to kind of marry this interest I had in just how the world worked. It wasn't really from a hug the trees perspective. It was very practical. It kind of still is for me, that just the world can't function the way we've been doing it, right? We're seeing the repercussions now. There's not enough stable climate. There's not enough water, air, we have to operate in a different way. And for companies, they were aware, the climate science was there, but it was very much a kind of risk management thing, right? Like, let's just keep the NGOs off our backs. Maybe we have someone who has a sustainability title, a few, maybe a little bit, but they'll just go and make sure the NGOs are happy. And, it's really just kind of a management of risk. And then, over some years, there was some sense of, hey, there's some innovation opportunities here. We can sell more products. There's a way to reach people. And I think the view of how you create value and the ways that sustainability drives that has really expanded. Intangible value is very much on the table, brand value, and that includes your customers being loyal, and I think in particular employees. There's a real buy-in now that if you want to attract and retain talent, especially millennial and Gen Z, you have to have values, you have to stand for something, you have to be tackling climate change and inequality. So it's on the agenda now, and that's a huge victory, right? I think in the last few years, we've gone from most being involved to pretty much everybody, right? Every company now has a sustainability report, has some carbon goals, every large company. So we won that first battle, but there's now this tremendous amount of work to do to change the way business functions in a pretty fundamental way and change the trajectory we're on. So I am incredibly happy that we're all at the table now, but there's just a huge gap between the leading companies and pretty much everyone else.
Yeah. Who are those leading lights in, this, conscious capitalist, net positive movement that we're starting to witness around the world?
Well, look, I'm not unbiased in this, in part because I just finished this book, or the book's coming out. We didn't just finish it, with Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever and, has long been considered really one of the leading CEOs in driving a big business towards a sustainable path. But there's surveys of sustainability experts that have been out for a long time. And for 11 straight years, Unilever has been ranked number one. So it's not just my view. The other companies that show up a lot in those surveys are, some obvious ones, Patagonia, IKEA, Natura in the global south. But most of those that have been leaders for a long time are privately held or family held. It's been rarer to see like a Unilever considered a leader. And I think there's a growing number of companies. I mean, Walmart has aspects of leadership in laggard, but has been pushing the agenda for a long time. There's companies like DSM, Novozymes. There's a whole bunch of, European companies that have kind of picked certain angles on this agenda. And there's all the clean tech companies. I mean, Tesla is arguably, one of the greenest companies in the world. So there's a growing group And the tech companies have really come on board pretty profoundly in the last few years. So the most aggressive like carbon goals in the world right now are really Microsoft and Google, kind of almost competing head to head on who can set the most aggressive goal for how much carbon they'll take out of the world. So we're seeing new leaders come in, but it's still not broad enough, right? We're in this place where the percentage of companies that has like a science-based target, right? A goal for carbon that says we'll reduce at the pace science demands. It's like 20% of the Fortune Global 500. It's better than zero, which it was, 5 or 6 years ago, but it's only 20%, right? On this existential challenge that we have, where that should be kind of the bare minimum goal that will cut carbon, in half in the next 10 years and completely over the next 30. So we've got a long way to go, right? We're getting there. We're seeing some victory, but we've got a long way.
I mean, I always find it fascinating, right? That, leaders and organizations are always so focused on the numbers and the data science and, the evidence and all the rest. Yet, sometimes leadership happens in a very sort of anecdotal and emotional fashion because, we've been doing a lot of work around innovation where, all the research, including from BCG, shows that, the more diverse your organization, the more revenue you've created over the last 3 years from products and services that weren't even in existence compared to homogenous organizations. The amount of, female managers is, closely correlated to the amount of disruptive innovations that your organization is responsible for. And of course, now the likes of Larry Fink at BlackRock are pointing out that, ESG is the only way forward. And most of the academic research shows that, companies perform well on environmental, social, and governance factors massively outperform their peers. So why on earth would companies, be so slow to move on this?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first, let me just respond to your thing about leadership. I think it's funny how much we believe that companies make decisions completely on science and data, right? When as if CEOs, CFOs are just not human, right? Like it's turned out with now decades of behavioral economics, which just completely changed everything I learned in my economics degree 30 years ago, that the people side actually is an enormous part of how we make decisions. There's no difference just because they're leaders of companies, right? We have our cognitive biases. We have a gut. We work backwards from what we think should happen to the data, finding the data that supports that. And I think that's partly an answer to why is this still so hard? Because there's inertia. There's the mindset that we've kind of all been brought up in. And we have, frankly, basically 50 years now of neoliberal economics, the kind of Milton Friedman view that shareholder value is all a company should focus on. And Paul, my co-author, and I, we're not sure that Milton Friedman would actually say the same thing today because the situation has changed. But that was kind of the standard. It was 50 years ago in 1970. He said, shareholders only. That mindset is now the dominant form of everybody leading businesses today, right? If you're 70 and under, this has been your entire adult life. And so you feel like anything that's you believe is taking you away from that focus is somehow bad for the business. And we're, I think, finally getting companies over that hurdle to realize that they don't just serve shareholders, right? They've been serving stakeholders in many ways all along. And that it's not a very good way to run a business to just say, what's my quarterly profit and not think about innovation, your customers, your employees, your communities, like not build a long-term base for success, which you need, right? And we've seen this decline in your world in innovation investment, right? The R&D investment has basically gone down in big companies because they're on this short-term focus. So look, there's just a mindset that we have to get out of, that takes time. Right. I mean, real transitions and paradigm shifts, they often don't come till there's a changeover of leadership. Right. I think as millennials come into power in business and government, there will be a natural mindset shift. Unfortunately, with something like climate, we don't have time to wait for that. So we're in this really tense period.
Yeah, I was curious to ask that question. I mean, we're hearing a lot about net zero and 2050 timelines, which to me feels way too far out into the future. It's not that far into the future, but it does feel a little bit too far away. And then of course, the IPCC in their most recent report is kind of moving the goalposts on this to say, hey, we've got 9 years, we've got till 2030 to get this right. What's your perspective? Should we be all having pre-traumatic stress disorder now, and or just flip into gear because we have the next 9 years, or do we have till 2050 to get this right?
Well, we don't have till 2050, right? Because the lead time, just in terms of infrastructure, right? If you're talking about energy systems, everything we build today, unless we close it down before the end of its asset life, it's here till 2050. That's what people don't quite realize. Like 2050 is now here. It's within the range of building a factory or a building of every 30-year mortgage, right? We're now in that financial and insurance period up till 2050. So the 2050 number, by the way, you're right. It's going to basically start moving forward because the science just gets more dire, frankly, and we keep seeing that the climate is changing faster than science predicted, which is not a good sign. So I do think, and you'll see the leading companies now, their net zero goals are 2045, 2040. Unilever did 2039 just to kind of be cheeky and try to push the boundary. So it is really critical that we don't just have these long-term 2040, 2050 zero goals. We have to move towards cutting in half by 2030. You need the interim goals, right? And I do think that target for zero will start to move forward. So, we can't wait. And you see this, I think, especially in some of the goals that are set by the banks, right? They're all now saying we're going to decarbonize our portfolios by 2050. And it's like, that's laughable. That tells me in 2049, you're still going to be funding a plant that lasts another 20 years. Like, they have to decarbonize their investments in the next 5, right? And so the pressure is going to build. And I don't know what's going to truly accelerate at the pace we need. We're lucky that the clean economy prices have dropped dramatically. The cost of building solar, wind, batteries, EVs, everything just dropping. So we're naturally heading that way, but we have to go even faster than that. And that requires systemic thinking, government action, business stepping up, civil society, and all of us as consumers really pushing for a faster adoption.
So, one of the criticisms, I guess, of the green movement and more sustainable consumption, conscious consumption, etc., has been that organic's expensive. You pay more for sustainable. You pay more for something that's built to last. Right. Fast fashion is there because some people can't afford to buy the Gucci bag, for example, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a counterfactual to this, or how do we kind of make sense of as consumers? Right. How do we make sense of our consumption choices? Is sustainable now at a point where it is actually more economical, maybe both in the short term and long term?
Well, there's no easy answer to that. I mean, you're right about everything you just said. I mean, years ago, green products were just considered, crappy products, frankly. They weren't as good. I think we're mostly past that. I mean, for lots of reasons. I mean, most products are good. And something like the rise of EVs and Tesla, where they're actually better, right? They're sexier, they're faster, they're stronger. There's plenty of examples of that. But you're not wrong that there's an upfront cost potential. We can't pretend it's win-win in every time frame, but it's often about the life cycle cost of ownership, right? It costs more to buy a CFL or LED bulb, but we got better as consumers and in companies selling us products in understanding that the cost of that bulb was actually lower because we would plug it in and spend less over the lifetime. And there's a lot of examples of that. I think, electric cars are reaching that point when you include maintenance, as in there's none. I have an EV and our maintenance visit was like checking the windshield wiper fluid. There's nothing to look at. There's no engine, there's no, it's a battery. And so there's a sense, I think, within business of starting to get a better understanding of the total life cycle cost of ownership, right? The total life ownership, where then you can see that things are actually cheaper. And clothes is a really interesting example. And there's a movement now. Patagonia's been on this for years, but I'm starting to see other big brands talk about making things that last, right? More essentials. If you buy a jacket that lasts basically forever, because Patagonia will repair it indefinitely, that is far better from your cost perspective than buying a jacket every 5 years because it breaks down. So there is an issue with upfront costs, but it's about, I think, buying smarter, right? And buying better. All that said, we can't deny that there's a consumption problem. And I think it comes down to a consumption problem in which parts of the world. And we talk about this in the book, that it's a very real concern that we just use too much. We know that. And so I think the kind of billion richest of the world, we have to have a long, hard look in the mirror about our consumption levels, because we actually need overall well-being and consumption levels to rise for 3, 4, 5 billion people to climb into the middle class, right? They need more food and housing and cars and everything. We may need to check our level of consumption and ask about needs and wants, for the richest billion. I think had we started this journey 20 years ago in earnest, we could get away with all of us doing fine. But I think we now just don't have the time. And so there are plenty of product categories where we can just buy better versions. But for some, I think we got to ask how much we need. And we referenced this at the beginning of the conversation about flying. We're kind of realizing, did we need to fly as much as we did? And I think it's worth questioning, And I do encourage people to ask kind of tough questions about their own consumption. It's not easy. It's really not easy.
Yeah, and then the impact, of course, then of creating some signal in the world, which is both. I'm thinking of someone like my Swedish compatriot Greta Thunberg, or Greta Thunberg, as we might say in the anglicized world. Coming up with this terminology or this movement around flight shaming, which even pre-pandemic reduced Swedish air travel by 4%.
Yeah,
because people felt so bad about flying in response to this, teenage girl who was, creating a groundswell movement. Yes, she stood on the shoulders of giants who've come before her, but it was really, I think, moving to see that movement of someone communicating both the science, but also the emotive part of the story.
Well, she's remarkable. She's remarkable. I mean, what she's done to bring kids into the streets. She started with just a sign by herself, and a year later, she's the cover of Time Magazine Person of the Year. Like, it ballooned in a pretty impressive way. So, yeah, I think what she's been able to do is remarkable. Do you remember she took a boat to come to the New York Climate Conference? And people are like, oh, but that was a footprint and whatever. It was to highlight the fact that there weren't systemic opportunities. There wasn't a plane on biofuels. Because as I just said before about consumption, we got to check ourselves. But the reality is the idea that we'll just fix this by our own individual, consumption choices is kind of ridiculous. We need systemic change so that the options get better and better for us. What I was just saying was in the intermediate period, we should probably dial it back in the richest parts of the world. But we should be demanding systemic change, right? That means what really matters is our vote and who we put in power, so we get things like a carbon price. So everything ripples toward better options for us, so that we can make the choices more naturally. And we don't have to seek out things that cost a lot more upfront or seem like they don't do what they're supposed to. There should be better choices that are cheaper.
Yeah, so... in our family, maybe we're lucky, but I guess I've sort of been brought up on this old school idea that you buy fewer things and you buy better, and an example of that would be in our home we've got a couple of Miele appliances, and of course Miele is not the cheapest option. But there's a wonderful story of Miele, and by the way, we buy factory second, so we actually save, and it actually brings back the price for us just in terms of the hip pocket. But there's a wonderful story from Miele in the former Eastern Germany, where a lady who had spent her large portion of her adult life living in I think it was in Dresden in Eastern Germany. And she needed to buy a new white good for her home. And she was 80 years of age. And she walked into the dealership that represented a number of brands. And he sort of thought, she's 80, she might not be around for forever. I'm going to try and sell her something, a brand that's a bit cheaper because, she doesn't need something that's going to last her 30 years. And she comes into this dealership and she goes, I want a Miele. And he's like, oh, well, maybe you don't need a Miele. And she's like, it's the only white good I can afford. And he sort of stopped in his tracks, and he's like, actually, you're right. She's like, I don't want to buy something that's going to break in 5 years' time. I want something that's going to last for 30 years. You're talking about these 30-year horizons, right? Yeah. And a brand that's going to look back and take back and repair and guarantee their goods. Yeah. And I think that, that sort of, which is a really kind of old school mindset that I grew up with from my, grandparents, very frugal. But, if they ever did spend, they bought something that was built to last. And now we have, planned obsolescence and all these kind of things, which is just crazy, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have a problem with our technology, right? I mean, I don't really need a new iPhone very frequently, but then the apps stop working, right? Like it stops being functional after like 4 years. And this is a problem. I mean, we have to figure out how we can slow that turnover, of products. And it's not easy. There's a lot of benefits of the digitization of everything, right? There's a lot of smaller footprints because of it, but the cloud that we all rely on is not very light. It's, they're the biggest energy users in the world now, right? Google and Microsoft. And that's why they've been embracing renewable energy so much. They have a huge energy challenge. But this is
and I mean just to defend some of our old choices when we did used to travel around the world is the fact that data centers or the digital carbon footprint is on par with the travel industry.
Absolutely.
So it sometimes doesn't get seen, but again here Google and Microsoft are kind of key drivers, right? Of even climate positive data centers, I believe. Is that right?
Well, there's a few examples of companies offering kind of a net positive storage where they've offset, But the thing that Microsoft and Google are doing, this gets at kind of the philosophy of net positive, is they're trying to change the systems that they're a part of, right? Microsoft committed to offset basically all of the carbon they ever emitted since they were founded. It was really the first kind of retroactive neutrality. So they're one of the major investors now in carbon sequestration projects, which are still really small, early technologies, but we actually do need to scale them up over the next couple decades. The IPCC, all that data, all that carbon budget, it actually depends on the world sequestering a lot of carbon in the second half of the century. We're like, that's built into the models, so we better figure that out. So Microsoft's helping try to build that market. And then Google, they've set a goal that by 2030, they want their data centers to be powered entirely by green electrons. So you're not offsetting, you're literally only having renewable power, which means solar and wind on site, lots of storage. And if you do plug into a grid, the grid has to be zero carbon. So it's forcing them to work on grid issues, right? They're getting involved in the systemic challenges. That's a kind of a wonky example of what being net positive means, that you're working on the systemic problems that everybody shares and trying to use your influence and leverage to make the change so that everybody's better off, and not just go, how can I get solar on my roof, but how do I make solar more broadly available or make the grid entirely green so that everyone in this region can plug in and create no carbon.
So you mentioned light bulbs a moment ago, and we've gotten better at understanding the economics and the planned obsolescence, and maybe partly because somebody had to get up on the roof or up on a ladder and change the light bulb every time it broke. And
True.
Some people would say the light bulb was a really good invention but it should be called a warm bulb, not a light bulb, given all the energy we lose. But that's almost like a nudging behavior for us to kind of go, maybe that wasn't such a smart idea. Maybe the high tech alternatives are better, even though they cost a little bit more. Are there any analogs, or are there any such sort of disruption to our ingrained behaviors when you think about, say, EV adoption or moving to solar at home, that you could think of, that we could design into the system so people start making some of these changes on a sort of personal family basis?
I mean, yeah, you have to make, it's, as you said, the nudge thing. You need the default option to be the zero carbon. So Tesla and the solar division, of their business, has like roof tiles, right, that are solar embedded. We need more and more of those kinds of options, where it's just a given. You start from a place of, oh, my roof should generate power, right? It should just be that way. And there's a lot about how we design cities and how we design the way we live so that the default option is I can walk easily or I can take a local bus or, I mean, to make it simple day to day actually takes a lot of hard work, right? You need to be thinking in systems and create systems that civil society, business, and government are all working together on so that the day-to-day choices are easier, so that they're the right ones. And look, I was an economist by training. It's not the only option and it's not as simple as it sounds, but a tax on carbon kind of is the most obvious of the important levers because then innovation ripples around it, right? If you make it more and more expensive to do the high carbon path, you start moving more naturally to the low carbon one. I mean, we just need to make these options easier. And so, yeah, I think, there's a lot of examples of what we can do, but but there's always anything that's easy for consumers, there's infrastructure behind it, right? And so until we build like charging stations, fast charging stations all over major countries, we'll only see so many EVs. And so there's like a disconnect right now because almost every large auto company is saying they're going to sell only EVs by 2030, 2035, but we don't have the infrastructure to support that. So we're in this weird time where I can't figure out why those companies aren't, lobbying heavily for massive public-private investment to put chargers up everywhere. So that's the kind of thing that needs to happen that just takes, grunt work, money and grunt work.
Yeah.
So that we can all make the easy choice.
Well, I mean, on that point, what systems are you seeing either in, smart cities or in regions or nations where you are seeing, systemic pivots to, a circular economy or towards a system that's, integrated or starting to become fully integrated towards, a clean future?
I don't know if there's any real region that's dominant in this. I mean, your home territory, Northern Europe, is generally ahead on these kinds of things, common good investments, just, with cities where everyone bikes, even though it's really cold. There's just a cultural and, again, structural, right? You build centers of cities where you can only bike, like you just set the rules. The nudge is pretty clear. You bet if you want to get from there to, here to there, you're biking. There's some benefits of autocratic societies. China's done more build out than anybody because they just decide to, right? They have more high-speed rail. So you can get between major cities now in 3 or 4 hours instead of 18 hours. The US, with our freedoms, we have zero high-speed rail. So there's trade-offs, and I'm not saying, we should have an autocratic leader. We tried that for 4 years and it was incredibly dangerous and they're still trying. So I'm not sure there's any one country doing it right. I mean, there's pockets of like Costa Rica is like a really interesting pocket of, investing in the country, going 100% renewable, got rid of their military like 20 years ago, like so they could just focus on human well-being and not spend on the things that weren't really helping them. So there's places like that. I think smaller regional cultures that have said this is a really huge part of who we are. But globally, it's really hard to find. I think there's states and cities in the U.S. that are doing better than others and truly invest in this. But it's difficult. Like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of inertia, and so we need some global rules and some national rules to make it easier.
And talking about, rules and I guess, transparency, disclosure, all of these things that the conscious consumer is now asking, even the likes of Tesla are not disclosing their carbon emissions at the moment. They've been criticized for this. Have you got any perspectives on that? If Tesla's not, talking about its emissions, why should Chevron or ExxonMobil, for example, do the same?
Look, I think to me, transparency is one of the grand mega forces, mega trends in the world. I think it's only going in one direction. There will be resistance and there'll be some examples, but I just don't see how long that can continue, right? I mean, I think we're at a point where at some point employees will just release the data, for companies that are, that are resisting. You're seeing employees rising up in companies that weren't quite doing enough, like Amazon, and changing the behavior. So I think it's odd for a Tesla not to share. I mean, Elon Musk, he's an odd dude, right? I mean, he's just got his own take on things that doesn't always make sense. He was kind of skeptical of the pandemic early on, for kind of a science-based guy. So I don't know what to make of their choices. I think for the most part, large companies are embracing, because they have to, a level of transparency because it's being demanded. and increasingly by investors, right? The ESG world is demanding information about your materiality, the issues that affect you materially, and your climate risk, your systemic climate risk as a business. So I don't think you can keep this in for very long. It's just, it just reduces trust in your business, and that just can't be good for the company in the long run.
What talking about Wall Street and disclosures and annual reports. What are some of the if you had to convince a CEO that shifting towards sustainability was the right thing to do from sort of a numbers or or even an emotional perspective, what would be your top three arguments that people can utilize to say that, hey, as a CEO, your legacy will be one that's best for all stakeholders, but including shareholders, importantly.
Well, I mean, you touched on a number of them. You can play the moral and legacy card, and I think that matters maybe more than I gave it credit for kind of earlier in my career in this. I really stuck to the green is gold, numbers game, and I've realized, as we talked about earlier, people make decisions on a lot of different things, and leaders who have made this transition and really kind of embraced it. I've talked to plenty, and a lot of them, almost all of them, there's some personal story, like their kids talk to them, or something happened. And it wasn't just the data needed to be there, so they knew there was a business case, so they could kind of justify it. But it was personal, really. But that data needs to be there, and I think the story of why this is good for business has gotten much clearer. You referenced earlier that there's pretty good data now that ESG investments are outperforming. I never want to put too much stock in investment performance, because the stock market is in many ways a casino. So. Because if in 6 months the SRI funds do worse, does that mean we shouldn't do it? I never want to say that's the main reason. But there's plenty of evidence now that companies with a long-term perspective, companies that have put stakeholders first, there's lots of different studies showing they outperform in a number of dimensions aside from stock. Just their return on equity, their turnover rates are lower, their engagement rates are higher. There's a whole range of things that make the business case. There's just plenty of stories to point to now of companies saving a ton of money through this lens of let's get rid of carbon, let's get rid of waste, reducing their risk, and again, driving innovation. That's what people want. They want the top line. And there's really no bigger innovation driver than this set of problems, right? We're talking about reshaping how we get around. Transportation, grids, manufacturing, consumer products, banking. These are all multi-trillion-dollar markets that are going to be changing and are changing. Do you want to be a part of the markets of the future or not? I mean, the main argument fundamentally is relevance. Do you want to remain relevant as a business where you're playing in the markets that are growing and people want to work for you? I don't think you need to tell them much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, of course, the productivity argument, right? And Andrew McAfee, that surely from MIT, talks about more with less, and he'd quote the example of the iPhone, replacing 13 different pieces of hardware from a 1991 Radio Shack ad, all of which would have, consumed planetary resources. And now, the iPhone, whether there's planned obsolescence or not, we still trade it in, return all the gold and cobalt, etc., which gets recycled by Liam or Daisy, the recycling robots. And then, we walk out with the latest version. As part of this sort of circular economy. He also, points out that in agriculture, we're using less potash, for example, for higher yields, less water for, again, bigger gains. Are you seeing that sort of Andrew McAfee, we're getting more productive while treading more lightly on the planet, or is that sort of tech pixie dust? Is that, is that a story of where we're headed?
There's a little bit of both, right? I mean, the if you draw out a line of carbon emissions per GDP, it's basically downward. I mean, in all developed economies, it's been decoupled, as they say, for the most part, in 20 large economies where the economy keeps growing and emissions are kind of flat or going down. So clearly, as the technology gets cleaner, there's greater and greater efficiency of carbon. There's no doubt about that. And the point is well made that the iPhone replaces a lot of other things. But as we said before, the tech industry is so fascinating because when you see rankings of sustainable companies, So many of them, the top rank is filled by tech companies because they apparently or seemingly don't have a big footprint, right? They're not deep industrial, and they've outsourced all their manufacturing, so it's not in their control. But like, that's just semantics to me. Like, if someone else is making all your computers with your label, that's your footprint. It doesn't matter that you don't own the factory. And as you said before, like, the data centers are now, consuming more power than planes. It's not true that technology doesn't have a footprint. They always make a good case in the industry that even if they're 2% of emissions, technology helps us reduce the other 98. And that's a fair point. And I think we need AI, we need GPS software. I mean, we need all sorts of technologies to make the world much more efficient. Buildings, transportation, agriculture, and those are all in the works, and they're all developing pretty quickly. So look, I'm a tech optimist too. I'll take the tech and figure out the problems with it later. I mean, there's a problem with EVs. We have batteries, no one knows what to do with it, end of life. But there's another opportunity, right? There's a chance for someone to figure out what to do with them, or to take them apart, or figure out different chemistries. These are all innovation opportunities. We don't, in my mind, we don't like, let's not solve the climate problem because we don't know what to do with batteries. It's just, there's always going to be new problems with every new sector and every new development. Let's figure them out as we go.
I mean, you alluded to supply chain there, and responsibilities, and sort of, greening the supply chain, responsibility to work with partners in a more systemic fashion. We know that the likes of Patagonia instituted this movement towards B Corp a number of years ago, which is, again, something that I think, is trending, but becoming a real groundswell movement, certainly in terms of, where we're looking at, everything from our, working with our local brewery, where I'm spending my beer money. Yeah. They're a B Corp, to my superannuation fund is with, Australian Ethical. They're, people are starting to make different choices in terms of who they work with. Yeah. Do you see this? And of course, B Corps like to work with B Corps. Is that is that kind of a movement that you would think is future fit, or what are the other sort of mechanism for people that have very sort of fragmented supply chains? Yeah. How do we get these things right in terms of the partners we choose to work with?
Well, I mean, you're getting at one of the really big forces is kind of business to business pressure. The supply chain pressure is real. It's been there for years, but it's evolving and maturing. I mean, Walmart's been asking their suppliers to, cut their emissions for 15 years, but you're starting to see companies, both carrots and sticks. Salesforce introduced something earlier this year that was really fascinating. It was like a contract. They didn't call it a contract, but it looks exactly like a contract with suppliers that they have to meet climate targets. They have to hit, science-based targets. And if they don't, they're in breach, which is a contractual term, and they will charge their suppliers, a fee. They will fine them. On the flip side, Tesco, the big retailer, and Santander, the bank, are offering really good financing terms to suppliers who hit ESG marks. So they're making their businesses lower cost. These are the kinds of things, and you're seeing companies just say flat out, our suppliers have to use renewable energy or we won't buy from them. This kind of pressure up the supply chain is, incredibly valuable. And it is, as you say, companies wanting to work with others that share the same priorities, because if you're trying to make your business more sustainable for your customers, it has to be along the whole value chain. So you need partners. And this is something Unilever did really well for many years, which is to go to suppliers and say, let's be partners instead of us demanding the lowest price all the time. Let's be innovation partners and solve problems for the world and consumers together, and innovate around these needs. And they develop much closer relationships and more trusting relationships. So I do think there's circles of B Corps or companies that are at least committed in the same way. That there will be a better working relationship, and they will choose to work with others that really get it, because it makes their own goals easier, right? If you're trying to reduce your total value chain footprint and your supplier controls most of it, you want to find a supplier that's efficient and reducing carbon. It's just, it's that simple. But yeah, that demand, that pressure matters, and it's changing things.
Yeah, and I know, my wife is a fashion designer and manufacturer, and of course, the textile industry is, had a terrible history in terms of its carbon footprint. But even there, you're looking at the likes of the Caring Group, which own Gucci, for example, making real strides into, sustainable fashion. And it's partly being led by luxury, which I think is kind of it makes sense that a lot of premium brands are driving this because they realize sustainability and profitability, but also sustainability and luxury kind of go hand in hand. It's the whole, built to last thing. Yeah. And, they're also creating, great resale markets now as well. So, secondhand goods to make sure that those also last. And, they're fighting their own, challenges around, how do we use, recycled materials? Is that going to be as, is the quality going to be as, as good, etc. So they still have challenges. But I guess when I look at, Nicole's business and her brand, when they're using a lot of, for example, they're responsible for taking plastics out of the ocean and then turning it into swimwear, but even her big wholesale partners like Matches.com in the UK, which is a kind of like a UK equivalent of Net-a-Porter. Mm-hmm. They're asking all their suppliers, all the brands they represent, to have a sustainability statement and they're starting to look into this supply chain of all of their partners because they realize that the conscious consumer is demanding this. Yeah. We do a lot of work with BMW, for example, on their sustainability initiatives, and the research there shows that 34% of people in Europe who would drive a Tesla, a BMW, a Mercedes, Volkswagen, Audi, would be happy to change brands based upon sustainability factors. Yeah. And it increasingly, despite the pandemic where everyone thought we'll just go into survival mode, that people are happy to pay a sustainability premium for goods now. I mean, that's a huge shift, right?
That is a huge shift. I mean, it's interesting if you have data to support that, because there's been surveys for years saying people will pay more, but a survey saying you'll pay more and actually paying more have been two very different things, outside of things like, organic food and things where people have paid more, but there's a bundle of reasons, right? If they think it's healthier, it's not just for the environment. And they've paid more in theory for cars. But, people pay more for cars for lots of reasons. They buy a regular BMW, because of the status, right? I mean, we pay more for lots of reasons. EV is now kind of one of them. The fashion industry is really fascinating because in some ways they were one of the early leaders. They started the Sustainable Apparel Coalition years ago to try to work with their supply chain. They developed metrics and tools and software, and they were kind of way ahead. And then fast fashion really took off, and it just dwarfed any of the work they were doing to reduce footprint, because the volume of clothes just started accelerating. And so that sector is coming together. Paul Pullman, my co-author, has, through his group Imagine, has brought together 25 CEOs of fashion companies, worked with them, and they signed this fashion pact to agree to, science-based carbon goals. They're working on biodiversity issues because really their impacts are upstream on land where we grow cotton. And, that's where the footprint is. Caring, you mentioned, a number of years ago, one of their brands, Puma, did an environmental P&L and said, if we had to pay for the natural services, how much would it cost? And it was basically all their profits. But their footprint, the vast majority was upstream, even with all the production and sewing, whatever, it's the growing stuff. And so, the fast fashion is a problem. And they, there's going to be, I think, some leaders who turn away from that to longer lasting goods, as we talked about earlier, but it's going to be hard. I mean, fashion is by definition here's the new fashion show this spring, here's the new things to buy. But you'll see some companies selling more basics and saying, we just don't need to sell as much. We can give people really solid, I mean, look, it's funny because, as men, I own some of the same clothes for 20 years. I mean, our fashion just doesn't change that much. It's really targeted at women. So there's a cultural question here about why. Why do they need to constantly change styles? Besides lapels and tie widths, how much for men really changes? A button-down, jeans, khakis, it's been the same stuff for forever.
Yeah. And of course, there's also the right to repair movement here. I kind of noticed, I don't know if it's visible in the 4K camera today, but I noticed a little hole on this Danish jumper of mine. It's built to last, but I think maybe it had been in our cabin for a little bit too long, and some moths got a little nibble. But my again, the frugal part of me just goes, well, that can be repaired. And luckily, I'm married to a fashion designer, so she knows how to mend a few things or teach me how to do it. And we do that. But, there's so much, of that kind of old school wisdom that's been lost as people have been, focusing more on fast fashion and just, chucking stuff. But it's changing. One thing I wanted to ask you, so if the goalposts are moving, and we're nearly into the end zone here, if the goalposts are moving from 2050 to 2030, 9 years is not a long period of time, particularly when you have kids and they grow up very, very quickly. Say we face apocalypse or climate apocalypse, or at least irreversible damage to our environment in the year 2030. If we take a little science fiction trip into the future, a little odyssey, and do a pre-mortem, what mistakes did we make, and how can we prevent them, Andrew?
So really, it's a great question. I think, well, first of all, just to clarify, when the scientists say, by 2030, we got to cut in half or there's trouble, nobody has said, or we all die, right? Like there's not one moment or one number that there's a cliff. What they're saying is, every 10th of a degree, it gets exponentially worse. So we really want to try to hold to 1.5 degrees and try to save low-lying areas, try to save the coral. There's just some tipping points that we know happen in the 2-degree range where we're headed very fast. But even if we miss it and we get to 2, it's worth fighting that we don't go past 2.1. And it's worth fighting, every 10th matters. So it's not like there's a cliff. That said, I do think by 2030, we're going to have a much better view on what stuff is kind of permanently lost. What cities, are probably now not going to make it because of sea level rise. Some of it's just, vast global inertia that we can't stop. But if we look back and we really didn't move fast enough, there's going to be a lot of reasons, but one of them we haven't talked about is just the vast misinformation campaigns going on so many topics that keep us from working together. We are now facing kind of like a final exam for humanity. Can we work together? And we are in this really historic swing to every person for themselves, especially in the US, right? My freedom, I don't want to wear a mask. Don't tell me, don't put a price on carbon. We're going to, in some sense, fail because we didn't listen to the science and misinformation reigned and made people think it wasn't that big a deal or it would cost too much or whatever the different denier, ideas are. And that we kind of let them get in the way. And I think the other source of failure will be, in that same theme of working together, if we try to rely on either government or business or consumers or NGOs to do it alone. Like if we think one of those is going to get it done, we have to come together. If we look back and say we didn't really get there, I think it's going to be because we didn't come together and work on the systems together. That's the only way we're going to move at the pace that we need to.
Yeah. There seems to be this kind of movement towards, regenerative, regenerative capitalism, regenerative entrepreneurship, people building, sustainable development goals into their business models and a real sort of creativity within constraints there, which I think is a really heartening story. Yeah. Whether it's, Zero Co here in Australia, for example, they're not unique, but they do it really well here. They take plastics out of the ocean. They turn them into refillable, little pods that they send out with all your, home cleaning product needs fulfilled, all plant-based. You have your forever bottle that you refill. You send these ones back, and it's carbon offset. The story. You've got similar things with Loop in America. That's now spreading globally, working with grocery partners and major brands. Again, it's the old, milkman, business model in a sense. But, for the modern age, you've got the circular economy with the likes of, Apple's iPhone, and they're all sort of looking at, sustainable development goals, and actually using it as a creative catalyst where they're, consuming less resources, getting more productivity, what sort of, what are your heartening stories as we move into, the final innings here? Yeah. What are your heartening stories that gives you hope for the future?
There's a lot of things. I mean, look, you're right. The Sustainable Development Goals, they really have taken off. And because they're just really well designed, you just look at them and you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of a business plan for a thriving humanity. There's no hunger. We've tackled climate. There's gender equality. Like, it's just the right list. And so it's easy for companies to go, okay, how do we serve these goals? How do we do them? So it gives me hope that, as I said, earlier, that everybody's at the table now, right? Like, because again, we're not going to get there without pretty much everyone. And so there's a bunch of companies that are just getting started, but they're there, right? They're in the conversation. It's hard not to be hopeful about the clean economy, in that the price of everything has dropped so fast. I mean, there were predictions 10 years ago that solar would be 5 cents a kilowatt by 2050, and we got there by 2020. I mean, like, everything has been, we're not good at exponential understanding, right? As humans, we see things linearly. So there's exponential bad stuff, but there's exponential good stuff. And the clean technology adoption has been, speeding up very, very rapidly. And then, the thing that gives me hope is more on the people side is the Gretas of the world and Gen Z, and they're pissed off, and they should be, and they're demanding more and more. And you see employees push their own companies. You see people talk to their parents and say, what are you doing? What legacy are you leading? I think the pressure is building bottom up, and it has to. So those things give me hope. I think we have some tough challenges. We're not going to get away from this cleanly, right? We waited too long, but I think we're not going to all die. Like, we're going to get there. And there's technology and people reasons that are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, fascinating. What questions should I have asked, Andrew, that I did not ask? And then secondly, what should we know about the net positive movement, including about your book, in terms of how people can best engage with you moving forward?
Well, we dove into so many interesting topics. I never really stepped back and said what net positive kind of means or how we're defining it. So I guess we should have talked about that, but it might have become clear as we talked. But the way we're defining net positive, I mean, there's people that say net zero or carbon neutral, and it's really mainly around carbon. We use it, and it's not interchangeable, very close to regenerative or that idea that a business creates well-being for everyone that it touches, through all of its products and services. So every product, every factory, every region it operates in, and for every stakeholder, employees, consumers, communities, government, everyone that we connect. This is the North Star. That's the goal that we need to set, because we have to move. We have to move in that direction, because we have to regenerate. We have to kind of fix some of the problems. So the ultimate question we're asking in this book is the world better off because your company is in it? And I find myself, as I wrote this and thinking about, is the world better off because I'm in it, right? There's this kind of personal element to it that really is moving, I find. And people, I'm finding, as they start to read it and it's starting to get out there, it's hard not to ask that about yourself. Like, am I leading a net positive life? So I hope people bring themselves to it. In the book, we start the journey towards a net positive organization really with personal. We have a chapter called "How Much Do You Care?" Like, it's fundamentally, do you care that the climate's in serious trouble, or that there's a billion people with living on a few dollars a day? Like, do you care about these things, and do you want to help solve them? So it is a very personal choice. So the net positive movement we're hoping to build, I mean, I obviously I want the book to do well, but we're trying to make this the way companies think about their goals. So we have a website, netpositive.world. You can sign up, kind of be part of the movement, get information from us regularly, get the book, obviously, read and understand kind of what we're talking about, and just think about how to apply it to your organization and to your life. And that's what we're hoping will happen.
So, I mean, you're very purpose-driven. Maybe a final question here. What was the aha moment for you, or your own sort of eureka moment where you tapped into your own purpose, or what drives you in making that net positive impact on the world?
I've always come at this from this kind of really practical perspective. That the model we were on just doesn't work, right? We're using too much stuff, and I want the world to improve. I want it to be better for me as I get older. I want it to be better for my kids. I don't know, I had a value shift, 20 years ago. I was coming out of normal business strategy, biz dev jobs. I was at a .com and it crashed, and it just it reset everything, right? I think there's these moments where there's a crash or there's a pandemic or where it kind of allows a reset. And you're seeing it with so many people now, changing jobs. And I found that moment of, I had been vegetarian for a number of years. I was changing light bulbs, and it just dawned on me, like, I work in business. Me changing a light bulb is really not the right scale. Like, there's got to be a way to leverage business. So there was this aha. And once you start reading about sustainability, the big aha really is that we treat environment or sustainability as some niche in business or some niche in policy, when, like, the economy and our society is within the environment. It's not the other way around. Like, we only function based on the natural environment. We're so disconnected from it in so many ways that it's just very practical, right? There's these pillars supporting our society and our economy. And why wouldn't we want those pillars to be stronger, right? So we can be healthier on a healthier planet, and the economy can be healthier, and we can all thrive. I mean, the fundamental driving kind of theme in my work is that business can't thrive unless people and planet are thriving. They all have to go together. And thriving is, to me, the goal, that everybody has the basics at least and has the chance to thrive and grow and be, everything they can be. I think that's the goal for me, is all 8 billion people have a chance to thrive.
Yeah, and I think that, that critical sense of equity is really part of your story by the sounds of it as well, and sort of reminds me that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. Yeah. And
that's the line. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been great having you on the show. Thank you for illuminating a path into the future, Andrew. And as always, great to hear your future vision.
Thank you, and I'm so glad you're picking up sustainability as a big theme. We need everyone and all the smart innovation thinkers like you. So it's great to see.
Well, the two go very, very nicely hand in hand as well. So, sustainable, or innovations just for the sake of innovation, I'm not a believer in, but I am a huge believer in sustainable innovation. So it's been nice to find that intersection between our worlds.
It's great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the show in your podcatcher, and I'd be super grateful if you leave a review. For more information about the Second Renaissance and our work on sustainable innovation, please visit my website, www.sorman-nilsson.com. We would appreciate if you can take a moment to share the podcast with a friend or a colleague and help build the movement. We hope that what we learn together on the Second Renaissance can help us all build a sustainable future for ourselves and our children. See you in the near future.